Right, good evening everybody. Welcome to UK Tours Online. We're going to talk about pubs this evening. So if you weren't expecting us to talk about pubs, you're in the wrong place. And we're going to do a little bit about the history of it, some of our favourite ones, pubs across the country, different ways of drinking, other things that one can do in pubs other than eat pork scratchings and drink pints of beer, and hopefully we'll touch on some interesting favourites as we go along. I do have here, if you just bear with me a second, I'll just share the screen. We've been putting together a little map of the pubs that we're going to talk about and some of the other pubs that we'll sort of refer to later on. I will be putting this up on the website sometime tomorrow and send you all a link so you'll be able to see where those pubs are. There are sort of Google Street Views within that. We'll put some images up as well. But we're going to kick off with Leo, who's going to talk about a little bit about sort of history of pubs, drinking, where they came from, what they went to, all of that sort of thing. So she'll be able to explain it much better than me. As I said before, if you've got any questions, just put them into the chat as we go along, and we will answer those at a convenient spot, either as we're talking or at the end when we've all finished. So let me just hand you over to Leo and mute myself so you can't hear me whiffling on. And here we go.
Marvellous. Thank you so much, Don. Good evening again, everybody. Yes, I get the rather unenviable task of giving you the potted history of drinking establishments in England in less than 5 minutes. I'm going to do my best. Those of you who have been on my archaeology walk, which I am repeating later this week, we'll tell you a bit more about that later. But one of my favourite things to talk about is the good old Romans. What did the Romans ever do for us? Well, it's one of the things I start my archaeology talk with, and we're starting our pub chat tonight with the Romans, because yes, the Romans gave us pubs. Roman tabernae would have sprung up along their main roads, and that's where we get the origin today of the word tavern. So the good old Romans brewing beer, setting up pubs along their lovely straight roads, and that's where the taverns, as we think of them today, come from. The Anglo-Saxons, they had ale houses. So we've fast forwarded, we're going to go quick. The Romans have gone, the Anglo-Saxons have moved in, and by the 10th century, so around about the 900s, these ale houses had evolved from little pop-ups, little huts, places selling beer, to meeting houses for folk to congregate, gossip, arrange mutual help within their communities. So not entirely unlike the concept of the reasons that you go to the pub today, to drink and chat and see your friends. And we know that the pubs existed in this way by the 10th century because there was a law that was passed during the reign of Ethelred the Unready. He was around in the 900s, and he actually prescribed fines for breaching the peace at alehouses. So you were getting yourself done for being drunk and disorderly, even in the 900s. By the Middle Ages, travellers and pilgrims could stay at dedicated residences, and usually these were provided by the monasteries or the religious institutions, and these were known as hospitals. And you think, hang on a minute, hospitals, surely that's, places for treating the sick. In this case, it wasn't a place for treating the sick. It was a place that was a safe place to stay and be provided with some respite, some rest. And so that's where we get our word hospitality from today. So hospitals to hospitality in the modern 21st century sense of the word. Entrepreneurial folk out there soon realised that actually that monasterial option was a bit boring and there was some money to be made. And so we began to see the earliest coaching inns, what became the taverns, the roadside pubs of today. They were springing up all the way across England along all the major routes and in the major cities from as early as the mid-1400s. So these would have provided rest and refreshment for travellers and their horses, more importantly. The hostelers of London, They were granted guild status in 1446, and about 50 years later, they were renamed the Worshipful Company of Innholders, which is what we still call them today. So the Worshipful Company of Innholders, one of the livery companies of the city, the corporation of the City of London. And in 1577, they actually carried out a survey of drinking establishments all the way across England and Wales. It was carried out for taxation purposes, what else? But this survey recorded almost 16,000 drinking establishments. That was alehouses, inns, and taverns all the way across England and Wales. And given the population numbers at the time, that represented one pub for around about every 200 people in England and Wales. So we were doing pretty well on pub numbers towards the end of the 1500s. Now, what do we drink in pubs? We, of course, I do not drink beer. I'm afraid I don't like beer. I have something else in my hand for this evening, which I will get to in a moment. Beer drinking, though, most people, when they come to visit this country, if you're over in the States, I'm seeing already lovely clients of mine who've popped up tonight to say hello. I will certainly have taken many of you to the pub. And the one thing everybody wants is a good old pint of real ale, British proper ale. We've been brewing beer again since Roman times. Brewing beer is a British institution. Some of the oldest businesses, not just British, but across the whole of Europe, if you have a little Google of what are the oldest institutions across Europe, they are either financial, and they're banks, or they are breweries. So our relationship with beer goes back a long way. We've been trading beer for a long time. I mentioned earlier the Worshipful Company of Innholders. Well, the Worshipful Company of Brewers, the Brewers Guild, is even older. They date to 1342. And I have absolutely no doubt that beer was just as popular then as it is today. But the pub which is my favourite, which I've got a couple of photographs of for you, we'll bring those up in a moment, came to prominence as the result of a drinking craze which began in the late 1600s. It grew into something of a crisis in the 1700s, so much so that it had to be regulated, and it increased in popularity again during the 1800s. And that craze, my lovely ladies and gentlemen, was gin. This little spirit in my hand. And my favourite place to drink gin, there are lots of options in London, but my favourite place is this place here. This is the Punch Tavern on Fleet Street, and it's in the City of London, and it's one of London's surviving Victorian gin palaces. It still retains its beautifully decorated, elaborate Victorian interior, and it is dedicated to the consumption. There it is. You go in through a lovely tiled and panelled entranceway, slightly plainer on the inside, but it's full of dark wood, soaring ceilings, lots of decoration all the way around in the plasterwork. And it's dedicated to the consumption of all things juniper. The gin craze began thanks to William of Orange, William III, and he massively increased taxes on French imports. He was a Dutchman, he had a beef with the French, and so he's taxing things like wine and brandy. So what's the other option? He then turned around and gave tax breaks to anybody who was producing spirits in this country, and so hundreds, if not thousands, of home distillers sprang up to take advantage of this, and the gin craze was born. The result was there were over 7,000 gin shops in London alone, and some 10 million gallons of gin being produced and consumed every year in London in the first half of the 1700s. And as you can imagine, with 10 million gallons of spirit being produced every year, obscene levels of drunkenness and alcoholism to go with it. It was particularly popular with the poor because it was being brewed en masse. It was cheap, and it became known, some of you may have heard it referred to as Mother's Ruin. And Mother's Ruin, thanks to the story, which went the 18th century equivalent of viral, when one poor, desperate woman strangled her own children in order to sell their clothes to buy gin. And that was one of the big scandals, amongst many others, which essentially caused the government to really step up and take note. Various acts of parliament were passed, and a publicity campaign was launched to quell the problem. And they asked the satirical artist and writer William Hogarth to create 2 drawings. And one of them was known as Gin Lane. And this is, if you peer at your screens, you will see this is the close-up of Gin Lane. And the key focus of Gin Lane is this woman sitting centre stage on the steps of the River Thames. And she is so wasted on gin that she hasn't even realised that she's dropped her baby. Her baby is falling into the river and she's too drunk to realise. And everybody on Gin Lane is wasted, not just in the alcohol sense, but look at the chap front right of that painting there, so wasted away. Gin curbed your appetite. So the poor, instead of paying for food, would drink a tot of gin. So that's why there at the front, he's wasted away. And everything on Gin Lane is ruinous. You can see right at the top there at the back, the buildings are in such bad state of repair, they're falling down. And so Gin Lane was all round a bad place to be. What was the alternative? Well, the alternative was Beer Street. Now, Beer Street, here we are, lots of well-fed, happy, hard-working, purposeful individuals. Nothing is, the only thing that is in disrepair, that thing with the 3, looks like a sort of cross with 3 balls attached to it, that's the sign of the pawnbroker. And so the only thing that isn't open for business and is in ruin is the pawnbroker, because nobody needs to go and pawn their belongings in order to buy gin. So it worked. I mean, they passed various acts of parliament that restricted the consumption and the production of gin and also made it safer. I love that Beer Street, today we think about, beer being, if you drink too much of it, just as bad as gin or any other spirit. But at the time, this is the mid-1700s, beer was seen as being less dangerous, less intoxicating than spirits, and potentially safer to drink than the water sources that were available, particularly in city centres. The Thames and its tributaries, by this point, by 1760, 1770, they are well on their way to being the grotesquely polluted and disease-ridden channels that caused all of those awful outbreaks of things like typhoid and cholera in the early part of the 19th century. In spite of the work that was done to calm the gin crisis during the mid-1700s, it turned out that even 100 years later, the Victorians still had a huge passion for their favourite spirit. And gin palaces like the Punch, my favourite, they were commonplace, especially here in London. During the second half of the 20th century, though, gin kind of fell off the radar. It was something that, certainly for me, something that my granny drank, and it definitely wasn't seen as something that was trendy or popular. Cheap imports like vodka became more popular, but gin has had a total renaissance, or a ginaissance, as it's being known as, during the last decade. So I'll give you some numbers. In 2010, there were 23 English distilleries. So we're just talking about England. 23 distilleries making gin in England in 2010. By 2014, there were 66. And this year, there are 228. That's just in England. 23 to 228 in the space of 10 years is an astonishing growth in terms of one little industry. When you bring in the rest of the UK, the total number of gin distilleries is nearly 450. That's a lot of trendy gin. And the Punch Tavern, therefore, has gone back to its Victorian roots. They specialise in gin again today with a specialist menu that features over 50 different types of gin. I shan't make you try all 50 if you come on a city tour with me. We'll perhaps just limit it to 2 or 3, but certainly not all 50. The Punch isn't the only historic tavern in London or even on Fleet Street. Some of you may have heard of a pub or even been to a pub called the Old Cheshire Cheese. That one claims to have cellars dating back to the 13th century. The building itself is claimed to be a post-Great Fire of London structure, so it dates to 1667. But if you asked any of us guides here to name which is London's oldest pub, which is the UK's oldest pub, we'd all probably tell you a different one, because there are, in London alone, there's around 24 different pubs that all claim to be the oldest, either because their roots are that old, or their building is that old, or they have bits of their building that are ancient. We don't really know, but it's a very good topic of conversation to have over a pint or three whilst sitting in one of them. I don't know about any of my lovely colleagues, whether anyone's got any that are much older, or any. Certainly in London there's loads, but I think, Don, you were possibly going to have a chat about.
I'm going to put myself on the spotlight and go out of London. So I'm going to show you a pub in Oxford, which well, there were sort of records that claim it goes back to the 1100s. It is mentioned in 1381, so we're getting a wee bit back there, good 600 odd years at least. And it's a pub called the Turf Tavern, which is hidden away in near New College and Hertford College in Oxford. So I'll share the screen again, and let's get us here. And I just want to, well, I will click on this link here to show you Oxford. Here we are in Oxford. This is the Bodleian Library, the Sheldonian Theatre over here. Bodleian again, just make out the Radcliffe camera. Any of you who are very, very old and remember the old Alec Guinness Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy from the late 70s, this is the view from that. And we go, people waiting for us, the Bridge of Sighs, which connects a couple of bits of Oxford here, and we're going to go forward. Now, New College is in front of us. This is the New College bell tower. But if you look down here, there is a thing called St. Helens Passage, which apparently used to be called Hell's Passage, but it's much nicer now, called St. Helens Passage. And I am going to see what I can do with the Google Maps to make sure I go down there rather than get myself lost, which is what I've been doing before. So there we are. Not a very interesting view, but we are going down this very, very narrow passageway. You can get another view of it down here. So there it is, New College Lane at the top. And we're still sort of surrounded by buildings, surrounded by college rooms, sort of slightly newer 1970s accommodation blocks. We go a bit further along, more accommodation blocks, past the bins, keep going. So we've gone about 150 meters, 150 yards, and then suddenly it opens out. You have the Turf Tavern here. The pub itself, the buildings itself date from the early 1600s, it's thought, when this front bar was built, which is about the time of the English Civil War. Oxford was a royalist stronghold. King Charles I moved the capital to Oxford. Under siege, I suspect, oh, there it says, English Civil War. Under siege, I suspect it was full of royalists with feathers in their hats and all of that sort of thing, drinking away before they went into battle. This here is the old city wall, and that's quite important because the turf, it was originally called the Spotted Cow, renamed in the 1840s. It was built outside the city walls, so it was just outside the jurisdiction of the city, outside the jurisdiction of the colleges, so it could have drinking, gambling, all other sorts of things that are associated with excess of alcohol. And so it was a little bit of lawlessness just outside the main city walls. If we go through into here, you can see it's got this wonderful beer garden, usually got benches out. This is the bell tower of New College in the distance. And if I zoom out, let's see if I can zoom out and show you the actual map. We can see there is New College. Let's get the satellite up. It looks a lot bit better like that. So the turf is here. Sorry, here. So that's where we were, just in that garden. These are the cloisters of New College. the chapel, the library, the new buildings, as they're called, built in the Victorian era, the old buildings that date from 1500 out into the garden. Might just drop us down into the cloisters, because it's a lovely thing to see. And these are the new college cloisters. So the turf is just over this wall. Any of you who've seen the various Harry Potter films might know these, or His Dark Materials, a TV series that was on recently. This was New College was, I forget the name of the college that's in it, but that was the Oxford College that was featured, and so this is the turf. I'll just show you some photos of the inside, if I can, and it's a pub. The low beams, lots of different beers, lots of different foods. You feel very sort of constricted when you're in there, because it's built 400 years ago. People were a lot shorter, so anyone now who's over about 5'10" is in danger of giving themselves concussion as they go along. That's it at night time, the college there. It is, and that's the front bar where you go in and sit down. It is back in the 1980s when I was a student at New College, and we had student grants. The government paid us money to go to university. Imagine that. The turf was our local boozer. That is back in the day when students could afford to buy pints of beer in pubs. These days at £5 a pint, it's actually quite rare for students to hang out in pubs that much. They hang out in their student bars more. It's been a university pub, a college pub, a student pub for generation after generation. In 1963, an Australian called Bob Hawke, who later went on to become Prime Minister of Australia, drank a yard of ale. Now this is a yard, big glass tube. You put 2.5 pints in it, and that's 2.5 imperial pints, so that's about 3 pints American, and you drink it as quickly as you possibly can. Bob Hawke managed to do that in 11 seconds, which is pretty good going. Claims to be a world record, but who knows, who's counting. It's also got a little bit of extra fame because in the 1960s, the turf, the garden there at the turf, is the venue where Bill Clinton smoked but didn't inhale. So this was claims to be, when the legend becomes a fact, print the legend, but this is what they put up on their boards there, that Bill Clinton in the garden there, as it was passed around, obviously he was breathing out at the time and passed it on to someone else, and I believe that 100%. You can always trust a politician. It's also one of the places which is, again, I'm showing my age here in terms of old TV. I've given you the 1970s and Alec Guinness and Tinker Tailor Soldier's Spy. This is the late 80s. This is John Thaw as Inspector Morse, the cerebral Oxford opera-loving detective, and Sergeant Lewis is his Geordie counterpart. And the Turf Tavern was one of the pubs that they frequented quite a lot, and it's been used again in the spin-off series. Lewis was in there, and Endeavour even they've drunk in there, because the place is timeless. However much they've tarted it up, you could be at any period in the last 200 years when you go into it. Derek, who is watching this, my friend Derek from Bolton, told me a John Thaw fact just the other day about Inspector Morse. Apparently, John Thaw, the actor who played Inspector Morse, didn't like the taste of beer. So just like Leo, his choice would not have been to have a beer, but the character meant that he had to always have a pint, always be relishing the pint of beer. And I think his acting chops were pretty good on that. He always convinced me he liked the pint anyway, but apparently he would have much preferred a glass of white wine or a gin and tonic, but that wouldn't have been Inspector Morse. There are various other pubs that in Oxford. Oxford, a hugely historic city, lots of very good pubs to go into. There's the White Horse in Broad Street, which much smaller but similarly cramped, that Lewis and Morse were always in. The Lamb and Flag, which is up towards St Aldate's. And opposite that, there is a very famous one, the name of which escapes me. Tim, can you remember it?
Well, hang on, wait a minute. Are you talking about the pub where the Inklings used to hang out?
That's the one.
That's the one J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis.
Yes,
hang out
right.
The Eagle and Child.
The Eagle and Child, or the Bird and Baby, as it was sometimes called. So the Inklings were this group of writers, and they met, and it was in the Eagle and Child where Tolkien would have shared his first stories that later became The Lord of the Rings. C.S. Lewis would have shared some of his stories that later became the Chronicles of Narnia. They make an awful lot of it. So if you go to Oxford, you go into the Eagle and Child, it is all over the place. You cannot escape it. It's a very nice pub, but in some ways the pub over the road, the Lamb and Flag, is a bit better. But of course, let me stop screen sharing and get back up onto this. It goes to show that pubs aren't just places where you go and have a drink.
Well, exactly.
Music,
You're talking about intellectual writings there, you see. And of course, writing groups happen in pubs. They still do happen in pubs. Of course, lots of our London pubs have got theatres above them. Famously, the Orange Tree, the Old Red Lion, the White Bear.
Islington, yeah.
Yep, it's a great pub.
Yep.
And then, of course, we've got all the music venues. So we've got the Edinburgh Castle in Camden, if you're interested in heavy metal, or the Three Famous Kings out towards Hammersmith, or the Ivy House in Nunhead, which is a local near me, one of the two community-run pubs in London. Quite extraordinary, that. The Half Moon in Putney, a great place to see pub rock bands. And it's sort of music which is going to bring me on to me talking about my favourite pub in the whole of the UK. And that is the Philharmonic Dining Rooms in Liverpool.
Let me just see if I can get that up for you.
See if you can get that one up there. Because we're going way up north now. In 2018, a certain James Paul McCartney did an impromptu gig in this very room that you're looking at here.
I think there we have
it. There he is, bless his cotton socks. Everybody was astonished. Now, you may have seen this because it was widely publicised. It was for the James Corden television show. And McCartney was going back to his roots because this is one of the pubs where he, as a young lad, played. The Silver Beatles used to play in here, and he went back to do an impromptu gig. I first discovered the Philharmonic Dining Rooms in the 1980s when I was an actor, before I became a Blue Badge guide. And we spent 3 weeks in Liverpool touring around. And one night off, I just went for a stroll, for a pint, and I discovered this masterpiece. It is one of 12 Grade 1 listed pubs in the UK. Now, to put that in focus, Grade 1 means it's architecturally la creme de la creme. So it's on a par with Buckingham Palace, Westminster Abbey, St Paul's Cathedral, the Tower. And I certainly know which of those buildings I would rather be in. And I would always rather be in the Philharmonic Dining Rooms, or the Phil, as it's known to Scousers. Spectacular. So when you go in, there's an Art Nouveau entrance hall, and then you come into this cathedral of comfort. You've got mahogany everywhere, and brass fittings, candelabras, stained glass windows, brass repoussé work. And if you look carefully up in the left and right hand corner,
Come to that.
oh, whoa! All the imagery inside the pub is related to music and musicians. It's called the Philharmonic Dining Rooms. Opposite is the Philharmonic Hall, and the 6 rooms within the pub are all named after famous musicians. My favourite 2 are the Brahms and Liszt. If you know your Cockney rhyming slang, you will understand what I'm talking about. It's on Hope Street. Hope Street is a magnificent street that runs through Liverpool, and you've got the Catholic Cathedral at one end, the Protestant Cathedral at the other end, and then you've got the Philharmonic Hall, the Philharmonic Dining Rooms, and the Everyman Theatre, and that's the reason I was first there in Liverpool. Another thing you've got on Hope Street is the Liverpool Institute of Performing Arts, and that's where a young McCartney and a young George Harrison went as schoolboys. Next door is the Art College, and that's where the young John Lennon went. So much later on in the 90s, my youngest daughter went to university in Liverpool, and it was always an excuse to go into the Phil and have a pint of proper job, which is the stuff you drink there. Now, after a pint of proper job, of course, you need to visit the facilities. And now, there they are. I can't vouch for the ladies' toilets, but the gents are simply spectacular. This rose-coloured marble, it's just extraordinary, quite gorgeous. So there it is. That's my favourite pub in the whole of the UK. I didn't talk about any of the 7 pubs in Soho called the Blue Posts, but if I can just briefly talk about my favourite pub name, and that is the Pyrotechnists' Arms. I'll say that again, the Pyrotechnists' Arms. Now, I believe the Pyrotechnists' Arms is unique. It is the only pub called that, and it happens to be my local in Southeast 15. If you know of another Pyrotechnists' Arms, please let me know. It got its name because the Brock's firework factory was on the other side of the road, and that's where people would go drinking after work. And it supplied fireworks for the Great Exhibition, and then up to Crystal Palace when it moved there in, between 1852 to 1936. Marvellous pub. Pubs have got such fantastic names, and I think, Rachel, you want to tell us about some of the pubs which, you tell us some of the pub names that you come up with. Cheers.
I do. In fact, I'm going to do a bit of the history of pub names because it's pretty fascinating. Well, at least being a London Blue Badge tour guide, I think it's pretty fascinating. And as Leo says, it goes back to the Romans. Those good old Romans, they get everywhere, even involved in naming our pubs today. Because apparently what the Romans would do in their tabernae is they would hang vine leaves outside to indicate that wine was being sold on the premises. Now, when they came to Britain, they found that vine leaves were in short supply, unsurprisingly. So they used vegetation that was local and abundant, and lots of that was from different kinds of bushes. So it's said that the origins of the pub name, the Bush, or the Holly Bush, or the Mulberry Bush, all come from this Roman idea of using vegetation as the naming tool. Now, I'm not so sure about that because really there you go, there's some examples of pubs called after various different bushes. I'm not so sure, because our first proper public houses, to give them their full title, really were only established in medieval times. And by that, we're talking about the 11th and the 12th centuries. And in medieval times, what people would do was hang objects outside their premises to indicate that alcohol was being sold inside, because it was a public house rather than a private house. So here you have a copper kettle. Unfortunately today, just a sign that's not even in copper. I mean, come on guys, get with the program. But a copper kettle would have actually been placed outside, perhaps a boot, or in some cases a plough or something agricultural, something that they would have had to hand to indicate what was going on inside. Now, as names and signage became more sophisticated, they went towards pictorial signs, because most of the population in the 12th century were illiterate. They couldn't read signs, so they needed some guidance as to finding the right place to go for a good old pint of beer. And in order to make it as easy as possible, those signs would have an association with beer. So that's when you start to get the jolly brewers, like this picture. You start to get things like the hop pole or the barley mow. Those kind of things all stem from the 12th century. Now, alongside these public houses, which are taverns for probably the working population to quench their thirst, you also have religious houses also acting as stopovers for pilgrims and people going off to fight in the Crusades. And the religious houses adopt religious names. So today we have hangovers such as the Saracen's Head or the Sanctuary, to give you a couple of examples, the Sanctuary being a part of a church. I think there may be a picture coming, there may not be, but it doesn't matter, it's okay. And so, yeah, there you go. There's the Sanctuary House, which is still very much alive and kicking, and actually not too far away from Westminster Abbey, so located near to a big church in London. So then the industry becomes regulated. Leo, again, she referred to some of the acts that came in to make sure that the industry wasn't doing anything too untoward. In my cynical view, I think that the government of the 14th century wanted a little bit of the takings that were being made. So they decided to public house adhere to the fact that the allegiance, because it was for the government of the 14th century. How could a pub demonstrate allegiance to the king? The easiest way is in its name. And so this is when you get a plethora of pubs called Crown. And the Crown is a brilliant name because the Crown has...
Oh, we seem to have lost.
Lots of.
Yep. We seem to have lost Rach.
Oh, bless her. Is she part of the South, the Southeast Virgin Media crash of 2000?
Exactly. We seem to have lost Rachel. I just see if she's back and see if we can get her.
If not, we can flick through.
Yeah.
There she is.
Back again.
Welcome back.
Hi, Rachel. No, it's not. It's not. Hello. Can you?
No, is it not working?
We lost you for a second. We were just on the Rose and Crown, and then we lost you.
Zoom is drunk. Yeah, Zoom is drunk. Or my internet connection is drunk, probably. So, well, I'll try again. If you lose me again, feel free to move on.
Yeah, we'll go on to Emma
Right.
if you drop out again.
Well, all I was saying was that the Crown was a way of pubs pledging their allegiance to the king It had longevity in terms of it being a name that they didn't have to change with the ever-rolling monarchs who were coming and going on the English throne. But towards the end of the 15th century, there were slight variations that came in, such as the Rose and Crown to indicate the end of the Wars of the Roses and the start of the Tudor dynasty. And with the Tudor dynasty, there you go, there's a picture of the Rose and Crown. With the Tudor dynasty comes the end of Roman Catholicism. And it's so odd, until I really sat and thought about it. I had never associated the dissolution of the monasteries with pub names. But all of a sudden it made sense that, of course, pubs, the religious houses that had been these stopover points for pilgrims and crusaders, wanted to disassociate themselves with Catholicism. So this one that you're looking at, the ship, might have previously been known as the Ark, and the cross keys, which is the next picture, might have previously been known as St. Peter. So all these little tweaks were made to the names of public houses, just to show that they were on the side of the king and on the right side of religion. Fascinating. And then we get to the point where they want to express even further allegiance to the king. They decide that they'll be called the King's Heads or the King's Arms, and that's an even safer option than just changing to the ship. There's a rather less elaborate frontage of a pub. But here we have a lovely picture of the King's Arms, the coat of arms that would have been for the king at the time. And heraldry becomes quite a popular theme to riff off in terms of creating more pub names. So today we have a wide variety of golden lions, red lions, black lions, white horses. We have red dragons. All of these are associated with heraldry and will have been pulled off some of the coats of arms from the time. And gradually we broaden out. We get names that are associated with different occupations, such as the carpenter's arms or the mason's arms or the bricklayer's arms. These are places where people who work in the same industry can congregate together, they can socialise, and they can discuss business with one another. And gradually we get to pubs that are named after famous people. Now, if we just keep that picture there for just a moment, lots of them begin to be named after the monarch. We have lots and lots of pubs that are called the George, but by far and away the most popular pub name that's named after a monarch is the Queen Victoria, often shortened to the Queen Vic. And this picture will resonate with those of you from the UK, because this is actually a fictitious pub. This is a pub in a long-running soap opera called EastEnders, and it's one of the centre sets that the action takes place in. So I thought it was quite nice to throw in the fact that even on television, the pub plays a key role in British life. Other famous people that pubs have been named after include William Shakespeare, but also, as this picture demonstrates, our wartime Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. You can't quite see his face on the sign there, but he is there hanging proudly above the Churchill arms. There he is. That's a better picture of Churchill. And actually, the Churchill arms is usually adorned with flowers at this time of year. But I imagine during lockdown, they've perhaps not had anyone to water the flowers. So they're starting again. I took this just last week. Now, all these names are well and good, and I love the history behind them all. But I'm always more interested in pubs with slightly quirky names. So Tim, with his Pyrotechnus arms, which I probably pronounced wrong, was brilliant. But I love the two chairmen. which sounds dull as dishwater, because you think, chairman, are they chairman of a board of directors? And to be honest, when I started working around the corner from the two chairmen, I assumed it was two chairmen of a board of directors. It was only when I looked at the sign more closely one day that I realised it's chairman of a very different nature, as you can see from the sign. Those are two men who are carrying a lady in a sedan chair from the 18th century. And the sedan chair became a very popular mode of transport with the gentry, with the fashionable people of the day. And it's essentially a box with a seat in it, carried about on two long poles, which are carried by two chairmen, one in front and one behind, as the sign so ably demonstrates. And the sedan chair became popular because A, it avoided you having to set foot in the rather muddy and other sort of fragrant aromas of the London streets that could be found. And B, it also was a mode of transport that could fit down narrow alleyways where horses and carriages couldn't get to. So it was quite a safe way of you to your absolute carriage and walk part of the way. So that is certainly my favourite pub, because I love its name. I love the fact it has these origins going all the way back to the 18th century. I don't know, Don, do you have a favourite pub name in particular?
I would say that it was, there's a pub called the Ship and Shovel. Yes, the Ship and Shovel in, let me just bring that up on, which is just near Charing Cross Station, and it's an interesting pub for two reasons. One is its name, but the other is that it is split over two sites. So here it is. This Charing Cross, one of the main commuter lines, the trains run in here, and you have the Ship and Shovel split across the way. So the two bars are in actual two separate buildings, and it's named after this gentleman who is called the wonderfully named Sir Cloudsley Shovel. And he was one of the admirals in the Royal Navy in the early 1700s, and he was in charge of a small flotilla of ships that ran aground off the Isle of Scilly near Cornwall in 1707. 2,000 men were killed, and it was that disaster that helped prompt the search for a way of calculating longitude, because the fleet thought they were somewhere else, and they ran on the rocks in the Scilly Isles, and disastrous consequences, the greatest naval disaster of its time. And I guess my other favourite one is one called the Georgian Vulture, which is mentioned in Dickens, and that's in the City of London. It's still there. There are a couple of reasons given for the name. One is that there were two different buildings. One was a wine merchant's, and they had a vulture, and the other was the pub next door called the George, and they came together after the Great Fire and became the George and Vulture. The other is that the barman, the landlord of the pub, had a particularly ferocious parrot, which everyone nicknamed the Vulture, and it became known as the George and Vulture. No one knows. It may just have been invented by Dickens, for all we know, and come from there. But it's a wonderful name, and another little pub buried in a little side alley in the City of London. Tim's got the Pyrotechnics Arms. Have you got others, Tim, that you're keen on?
Well, I particularly like the Ship and Shovel. In fact, Don, I remember having a pint in there with you.
Or at least one, yes.
Yeah, several. Yeah, I like the Swan with two nicks. or swan with two necks, as it's probably more correctly.
Shall I jump in here then, Tim? Would this be
Go
a
for
good
it, Emma.
moment?
Go for it.
As hello everyone, absolutely great to see you all, and thank you so much to all my colleagues for all their information and facts and things. So my talk's going to be a little, I'm just putting myself into speaker view. Can you put me on spotlight?
Yep, will do. Let me
Great. That would be great. Thanks, Don. Right, hi, it's Emma here. So talking about pub names, I've got quite a favourite. Thinking of Cloudsley Shovel, my local in London is the Surprise in Chelsea, and but I think that's named after a ship called the Surprise. So there's a nice tie-in with Admiral. Was he an admiral? Admiral Shovel. But actually, what I was going to say to you all was that if you can't get the two chairmen, if you just can't find two chairmen to take you to the pub, then what you could do is hop in my car with me, because I'm a driver guide and I'll take you out to the countryside. And we have a slightly different sort of pub experience, perhaps, waiting for you out there. And the Swan with the two necks is a bit of a country pub name. And that comes from actually not the necks of the swan, but as Tim gave a clue, nicks. And the nicks in question were nicks that used to be put in the beak of the poor swan when it was counted and checked for health during a ceremony called swan upping that takes place on the Thames every year, on the River Thames. And this is because swans that are not otherwise owned by other people all belong to the Crown. So the livery companies of London that own some swans wanted to put their marks on the swans' beaks. And they still go swan upping today, but not by marking the beaks, I have to say, by ringing the swan's legs, because it's not a very nice experience for them. But I do want to now transport you in your imaginations to a small village in the Cotswolds beyond Oxford, where you might have stopped for a drink at the Turf or the Eagle and Child, but I want us to carry on into the countryside and go to the Swan Inn at Swinbrook. And I think Don very kindly is going to bring up, he's absolutely brilliant with photos and Google. There we go. There it is on Google Maps. Absolutely lovely. Oh, there it is, situated, the Swan Inn at Swinbrook, situated on the River Windrush, just on the banks of the Windrush, in a sleepy village called Swinbrook. And the reason I've picked this pub as one of my favourite pubs to show you is it's got a few good stories attached to it. A family called Redesdale owned the village of Swinbrook in the 1920s and 30s, between the mid-20s and the mid-30s. Lord Redesdale was, well, he was an interesting character. He was quite an aristocratic Englishman. He had 5 daughters. Now, these girls were known as Mitford. This was the family name. So posh families in England often have lots of names, more than one. So the daughters of Lord Redesdale were called Mitford. And I just want to point out the one in the middle to you. She was the youngest, and her name was Deborah. Now, all the Mitford girls had interesting lives, and I'm not going to go into them today, but Debo, as she was known, became the Duchess of Devonshire. And she lived at a very grand stately home in Derbyshire called Chatsworth. And I hope one day you'll come to the UK if you haven't, or if you're in the UK and you haven't been there, that you'll go and have a visit to Chatsworth. It's amazing. But Debo also owned the Swan at Swinbrook, believe it or not, because her father, although he used to own the whole village, and she spent part of her childhood in Swinbrook, and in fact, lots of the Mitfords are buried in the Swinbrook village church, he did manage to hang on to the pub, although he had to sell off most of the other properties for all sorts of reasons. The family finances didn't hold up, and Debo ended up owning it. So let's just, if we can go back to the photo of the pub. It was terribly well run, and they do fantastic food. And one of the great things about going to country pubs is the food. And they have really become not just places to go and drink beer or gin or anything else, but sort of gastro centres, and they're dotted all over the country. And in this particular one, they had some a rather famous visitor turned up it was 2014. I don't know if you'll recognise them, but they went in and ordered a drink at the bar from Archie or Ewing, who took over the pub from the Duchess, from Debo. And there they are, leaning on the bar. And I don't know if you can actually see who they are. One of them is David Cameron, who was our Prime Minister at the time, taking his mate, Hollande, Monsieur Hollande, the President of France, to the pub for a pint. So there's rather a lovely photo. And it also played a bit of a starring role in one of the episodes of Downton Abbey, as the place where Sybil, the daughter of the Earl of Grantham, eloped to meet up with his chauffeur as they ran off together to get married. And that was filmed at the Swan. But Swinbrook's a really lovely village. It's got one of the most beautiful cricket grounds in England. And that's right opposite, on the other side of the riverbank from the pub. But be jolly careful if you go there and park your car. Make sure you don't park on the edge of the cricket ground while you go into the pub for lunch, because you might come out and find that you've got a smashed windscreen. There's no netting between the cricket ground and the road. It has a lovely garden, and they have bantams, because Debo was a great raiser of chickens, and indeed she mentions them in lots of her autobiographies. So Bantam News will keep you filled in on the Swan at Swinbrook news. Now, if we just were to carry on and meander through a few more lovely Cotswold villages, we might get to the King's Head at Bledington. So I'm really grateful to Rachel for explaining the origin of the name King's Head. Because I always wondered about that, and I thought, well, how did they get hold of the King's Head? And did they have a King's Head, or was it to do with a king whose head was chopped off? But no, it was more to do with showing your solidarity with the king, to give your pub the name King's Head. And the King's Head at Bledington, I just want to mention quickly, because this year it was named Inn of the Year in the Good Pub Guide. So if you're traveling around the UK, I highly recommend that you download the Good Pub Guide app, because it gives you a really good potted synopsis of what the pubs are like. And they have you can search by area. So if you're driving around and you're not sure where to stop for lunch or where the good pubs are, then the Good Pub Guide is as good a place to start as any. And notice they're known as an inn. And that's because a lot of pubs, especially in the countryside, are places where you can stay. They have rooms. And that would go right back to the time when you would move around the country with a horse and carriage, and the inns were places where you would stay overnight, rest your horses or swap horses for different ones. And that's why they were known as inns. The last one I want to mention is the Ebrington Arms. And somebody in the chat asked a question about arms and why arms are mentioned in pub names. And I think that was something that Rachel touched on maybe when she went a bit, sadly we lost her a bit, that arms refer to coats of arms. So it goes back to heraldry. So if you were on the side of your lord, for example, in a battle, then you would wear a tunic over your armour with literally a coat showing the arms that would identify who you were fighting for, yeah, and who was on your side. So I think that's where it goes back to. So Ebrington is a village very near Stratford-on-Avon. So that's a really good place to stop if you're on the way to go and see a play, perhaps at the Royal Shakespeare Company Theatre, the Swan Theatre in Stratford, because there are lots of swans on our rivers. And that's a nice tie-in link there. The Ebrington Arms does fantastic food too. So if you go in to a country pub in the UK, perhaps after a walk on a Sunday with your favourite friend in tow, you're very welcome to bring your four-legged friend into the pub, by the way, after your walk through the Cotswold countryside. And there's a photograph, Don's doing brilliantly accompanying me with my photos. There's one I took recently on something called the Wychavon Way, which is you can go for a long walk and then turn up for lunch in the pub. Now, if you're a driver, there is a little bit of a problem, isn't there, about pubs? What are you going to drink? And the good news actually is, although beer is fantastic, and the beer mixed with the barley, mixed with the hops to give it that sort of bitter traditional taste, there are lots of alternatives these days for those of us who either don't like to drink too much alcohol or don't drink any. And I remember when I was a young person going into pubs and thinking, what on earth do I drink? Because I don't really like beer either. Good news today is, if I'm going and I'm on my driver guide day, I'm not drinking any alcohol, I've got a drink here, which is absolutely delicious. And I highly recommend it. It's made of, bing, bing, elderflower cordial. You can literally pick elderflowers all over the hedgerows in late May, early June, and make that delicious drink yourself if you don't want to buy it in a shop. You mix it with a trendy tonic water and a bit of soda, and hey presto, you've got a fantastic alcohol-free drink. And just to give you an idea, the market in alcohol-free drinks is growing exponentially at the moment, because people won't drink and drive anymore, so they won't want to go to pubs and have what we used to call one for the road. Can you believe people would have a drink and then get in their cars and drive? And that's completely unacceptable these days. So I have really rushed to get through this, but I hope I've given you a little sense of what fun it is to go out into the countryside and visit local pubs. And some of those, Tim mentioned one in London owned by the community, but there are community pubs as well all over the country that are owned by the villages, because they're so keen to keep the pubs going, because there's such a focus of community life, and they're places where everyone in the village can meet each other, meet up for a drink or a meal, or just sit by the fire and chat, go to a quiz. Lots and lots of activities supported by pubs and taking place there every weekend all over the country. So go and try some out. And I think Don's very keen to take over and round up for us, but thank you all.
I will just see if there's any more questions. There's been a couple of questions come through. A couple of, yes, Emma pointing out that New College was Jordan College, that was the name of the place, I couldn't remember, in His Dark Materials, which was filmed there. If anyone's got any questions, do put them into the chat. Someone has asked, is there any history, or Ruth has asked rather, is there any history of pubs being closed in response to disease outbreaks? So there's an interesting one. I think Leo is going to...
Yeah, the short answer is no. Even during the plague in the 14th century, during the plague, the Great Plague of London in 1665, there were closures, but nothing on a, regulated must do, and it applies to everybody. This, in the 21st century, coronavirus has been the first time as far as we are aware, where it has been a national regulated by law statute that everything must close. We didn't even close the pubs during the Second World War, during the Blitz. Everything stayed open. So this really has been, for us Brits who like a drink, it's been a very, very strange 14, 15 weeks. Yeah.
Although there's before the First World War, pub hours were pretty much unregulated.
Yeah, 24/7.
The fear that munitions workers were drinking far too much that brought in various licensing laws during the First World War, which meant they could open for 3 hours around lunchtime, then reopen in the evening, would have to close at 10:30. And that lasted all the way through until the late 1980s. So we were still working on First World War licensing laws right through until I think it was 88, 89. And I remember having my first beer at 3:30 in the afternoon after the licensing laws had been relaxed, and feeling how illicit but wonderful that was at the time. And that leads on to a question from Steve that says, are pubs doing more table service these days, or is it still that you have to belly up to the bar to get your food and drink? Well, because of the regulations to do with coronavirus, you can't go to the bar anymore. It's all done by an app, or it's got to be waiter service. But hopefully that will go back to normal, because yes, pubs are doing more waiter service, particularly if you have food. But one of the great traditions of being in an English pub is elbowing your way through the crowds of regulars at the bar, waving a £10 note in your hand to try and get the attention of the barman, so that you can get served. And if we lose that, we lost a great bit of our history and tradition. I can't say any more than that, including the bit where the barman comes up and you go, he's next. So that all of these things we would be less of a country if we lost them, put them that way. Any more questions coming through? Sorry, just unmute Rachel. Right, no more questions. We're going to finish off with a few quotes. I think everyone had a quote. We are recording this, so we will put it online. I'll also put online the map of all these venues. So if you want to see where the Punch Tavern is in London, you want to see where the Swan at Swinbrook is in the countryside, that map will be on the website along with the recording of this in the next couple of days. So we've each got some quotes about pubs and drinking. Let's start with Tim.
Well, I'm gonna start with a legendary drinker, W.C. Fields. Most of his quotes about drinking are not repeatable, but one that was it was a woman who drove me to drink. I didn't even have the common decency to thank her. Over to you, Emma. Have you got one?
Yeah, well, not exactly a quote, but I've got a little rhyme for you, based on I think quite a well-known poem, maybe. Oh, to be in the Cotswolds now that summer's here. Take me to a country pub, but please don't make me drink the beer. Okay, so now, should we hand over to Rachel?
Well, mine is, I've already mentioned him once, but Winston Churchill. He liked to drink or two, and apparently he was having dinner with Lady Astor one evening, and Lady Astor was askance to find that Winston Churchill was drunk. And she said, "Mr. Churchill, you're drunk." And his reply was, "Yes, madam, I am. And you are ugly. But in the morning, I will be sober."
And Leo.
Oh, and Leo. Sorry, Leo.
Sorry, you got one for us, and then I'll round up after that. And I've got a couple of quotes.
Marvellous.
Let Leo do hers.
Yeah, I was torn. I couldn't decide which to share with you. Any of you familiar with Martin Luther, who was the 15th century religious soul who was pushing reform? He has some great ones about beer, but I knew that there'd be some comedy ones amongst my lovely colleagues. So I'm actually going to do a poem for you, which is by Edgar Allan Poe. And so, just to raise the tone a little before we sign off for the evening, this is Edgar Allan Poe. Fill with mingled cream and amber, I will drain that glass again. Such hilarious visions clamber through the chamber of my brain. Quaintest thoughts, queerest fancies come to life and fade away. What care I how time advances? I am drinking ale today.
Oh, that's very nice. Yeah, that's very. Yeah, I won't try and top that. I will do a couple of things first. One, I'll just tell you what's coming up. So those of you who haven't booked tours with us or seen us do things, there are a few things coming up. Tomorrow evening, London time, I'm talking about the British Museum, some of the ancient treasures of the British Museum. Parthenon marbles, Rosetta Stone, Egyptian mummies. Wednesday morning London time, particularly for our Antipodean friends, or those of you who want to start the day with a little bit of vigour and intelligence. Rachel is doing Welcome to Bath, the beautiful city of Bath, which also has a large number of wonderful pubs in it. Thursday evening, Leo mentioned it earlier, the Romans, the archaeology of the City of London. Dig a hole in the City of London and you're digging your way literally through history. And Leo will explain that on Thursday. Saturday, Rachel is going to talk about writers, British writers of the 19th century, so from Jane Austen all the way through to Oscar Wilde, including Charles Dickens, obviously, of course, and locations associated with those. And on Sunday, Leo is going to take you around Shoreditch and Spitalfields to talk about street art. So they've got the range of different things that we're doing encapsulated in 2 days, from Victorian literature through to 21st century street art. So uktoursonline.com, follow the links through to the events page and you'll see everything there. I've got 2 quotes. One is another Churchill one, seeing as he seems to have been popular. I never believe the Lady Astor quote. I think it's just too rude for him, but again, it's one of those ones that is has become legend, so it is always used. But he did say, I've taken more out of alcohol than alcohol ever took out of me, which I think is a motto. And the final one I'm going to share with you on the map, as I said right at the beginning, this is, and you will now see where I came from. This is where I live now in London, but I'm from up here. And the pub where I started drinking many, many, many years ago, we used to sneak out from school. So this was when I was about 17. The school was back here. So this was the nearest pub to it, the Merlin. God, it's a wonderful place, and people, wonder why I left and came to London. And the quote that I'll leave you with, which is represented by this, is "Never drink in a flat-roofed pub," and that shows you why. So thank you all for coming. It has been lovely. We have talked far too long. But we'll do some more of these and later on. We're not sure what we're going to do next one. Maybe it might be our favourite kings and queens, might be our favourite history books, might be our favourite places to get a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, things like that. And hope you'll join us then. Hope to see you on some of our other tours. I should have had a pint by now, but it's a pint mug of tea. So cheers. Thank you all for coming, and see you all soon.
Cheers, folks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.